about the SAP Indirect Usage. We'll be speaking about giving you a heads up on what exactly indirect usage is, uh, and then the various ways to identify what exactly an indirect use is. In SAP, what are licenses or that you have to look at, and what exactly the SAP contract document speaks about, and how you can regulate the indirect usage. Uh, what are the various types of indirect usage, and then we also give you at the end of the session quick tips and recommendations on on the negotiations, with SAP on the indirect use. The primary introduction or the first set of slides basically explains you about indirect usage, and then we'll take you through the in-depth understanding of it, and then we'll also tell you how exactly we can help you with the indirect usage analysis. So today webinar will be run by me. My name is Raghu. I had ToggleNow software solutions in India, and my friend Sebastian, who is from US, will be explaining more on the indirect usage, and what all compliances you have to follow, what exactly is the way we need to identify it. As I said, at the end of the session, you are most welcome to raise your questions. Okay, maybe you can use the chat option to leave your questions, and we'll answer those one after the other. And in case if you have any other questions, you can, raise them. You can unmute yourself and raise those questions as well. So the reason why we are speaking about indirect usage now is with the recent Diageo, incident that was happened. So these companies basically based at UK, which is a big drink company, which has procured software licenses. They are using SAP from 2004, and then recently they have got into a dispute. It was started in 2012, but then recently there is a verdict on this case wherein they have ended up paying huge penalties and license fees to SAP. So what they did basically is they were using a third-party software, non-SAP software called Salesforce. I'm sure everyone is aware of what Salesforce is. So they were using this software to connect, their sales staff, to access certain data from SAP. So there are two different applications that they were using to access the data using XI and PI systems. So majority of our customers are, our known contacts normally raise this question. Okay, we have an exchange infrastructure or the process integration systems that were installed. So are we compliant enough to handle these indirect taxes? So there are different ways to look at it. So in the next set of slides, we'll explain what exactly and how exactly SAP looks specific access as an indirect access. Right. So in this specific case, especially 5,800 customers have identified as named users, and unfortunately, the company has to end up paying, procuring licenses and as well as additional interest fee to the SAP to clear this particular, case. So let's understand what exactly indirect access or indirect usage is. So if you have any application that is accessing data from the SAP, it can be get data or read data or post data. So whether it is a read or write, if you have any third-party legacy system or any application that is connected to SAP, okay, it is termed as an indirect access or indirect usage. Or at the same time, if you have integrated any third-party systems, right? It can be an implementation done by SAP or any of the system integrators. So any third-party integration is also termed as an indirect access. Or in case if you have developed certain mobility related apps, mobile apps, native mobile apps, or for your day-to-day transactions, right? So, or using any handheld devices or kind of physical kiosks and other physical devices that reads the data or writes the data into SAP, right? Even that case is called as an indirect access. So you might have a question here. Uh, you might have procured enough licenses from SAP, right? But maybe in the last couple of years, you were really looking at all those things, right? Ensuring that, okay, you are at par with your licenses, your bill of materials, and, also checking all the named users. But still, there are two different things you guys need to look at here. One is direct access and the other one is indirect access. Direct access is nothing but your named user license who actually log into SAP to perform certain activities. So the licenses that were procured or something, okay, that you look at the, the named users licenses for the direct access only. But you really don't know the amount of uh, usage or the amount of interfaces that you have, and how many transactions those backend users are performing in the system. So evaluating your indirect usage is very important even though you have enough licenses, because one fine day SAP might come and then say you're not utilizing the process, the existing licenses properly, or you have a lot of interfaces and you have to procure more licenses, right? So I would like, uh, I welcome Sebastian to actually take from this slide and then explain how exactly we look at the indirect access or usage. Uh, Sebastian?
Yeah, thanks very much, Raghu. This is Sebastian. I'm based out of New York City. Very happy to be partaking in this webinar tonight with you. Also from my end, thanks everybody for joining. I know this is outside of the regular 9 to 5 sort of workday, but we're very happy to have you. And as Raghu said earlier, these sessions I think really come alive during the Q&A following the presentation. So I would encourage you, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll save some time toward the end to actually have a bit of a dialogue and talk about what indirect access might mean for you. So maybe to add to some of the things that Raghu has already touched on, indirect access definitely deals with the kinds of scenarios where you might be leveraging interfaces to allow access to SAP, either to employees that might not be a part of your company, they might be working for a business partner. It might also be, the common applications like a Salesforce, like a Workday that have been connected to SAP. But one thing that I want to stress, because I often get this question from our clients and they seem to be a little bit confused about the matter, it's not only Salesforce and it's not just Workday. I would say that in the majority of the cases that we've looked at, it can actually be a homegrown application, something you've deployed many, many years ago, and so far SAP has never brought it up during the self-audit. And we definitely see that a recent trend has been to gather more data during the recent self-audits, maybe for the last couple of years, and also take a closer look. And what we're going to do today is two things. We're going to look at a few examples of what specifically makes up indirect access, and then also tell you a little bit about what we typically see is the motivation on SAP's part behind all of this, right? So maybe starting with asymptomatic recognition, Raghu already mentioned, oftentimes it's third-party applications. And, if you ask yourself, everybody has interfaces on their SAP landscape. It's been encouraged for decades. It was part of SAP's strategy to sort of show, hey, we have a very open system. You can connect multiple systems to it. And it's really only started in, I would say, 2012 that SAP has, used it as a way to find additional revenue and license those situations with their customers. So what I can tell you is that oftentimes the whole idea of indirect access really starts with, when you're giving access to SAP data to people that don't have their own named user account. We all know that the contractual language of SAP is already difficult to understand as it is. I know that people often ask, what is my license entitlement? That's not very clear. But when it comes to indirect access, we're mostly looking at cases where there's no login through the actual SAP GUI. So you can imagine with a Salesforce, you might have a significant amount of your people logging in to the CRM system who might not have their own SAP named user account. And in the cases that I look at, let's say you have 20,000 employees, I would say that not all of those typically have an SAP account. So let's say you have 10,000 SAP users, 20,000 employees. All of a sudden you're adding a portal like this. It could also be for human resources. And then you run into an issue because you're essentially allowing additional people access to SAP data who might not have their own named user account. So second bullet, it might be an external user group. So these could be your business partners that are maybe putting in orders. It could be a web shop. Oftentimes we work with companies that have built an e-commerce solution that might be writing back data to SAP. Overall, I think the common theme is you are generating, maintaining, or displaying data productively outside of the core SAP applications. So what that also means is that just because you might be running reports and displaying data, that doesn't protect you from potential SAP indirect access exposure. So it's really any kinds of data manipulation that will be important. And Raghu, would you mind going to the next slide real quick? Thank you. And to show you a little bit better, how this concept works, by looking at an actual example, we've put together something here that is a homegrown applications. And what this is, just so you have an idea of some of the cases that we often analyze for clients, let's assume that this is an automated parking system. So at your company headquarters, you have a parking garage, and every time that your employees come in the morning, the gate opens, they have their ID scanned, and so we're using that data to feed that into SAP, so we know when people have arrived and when they've ended their workday, and we're sending that data downstream, so that would be the bottom right side of this diagram. And here's one really interesting point that I want to make right now. Just because we're sending data to SAP doesn't necessarily put you at risk for indirect use. We always have to understand what is the context of how you're using that data, and oftentimes we want to find out, is there any value that you're getting out of these interfaces, right? So if you look at the bottom left side, it says data is used in human capital management for payroll processing. So that's really where it gets tricky with indirect use, because essentially we're feeding data into SAP, it's coming from outside, and then you're processing that data in a way that you're deriving business value from it, right? So we're using it for payroll processing. There is a certain amount of value we're getting out of this, and that's the example that we're going to take a closer look at today. On the other hand, you see the other bullet right next to it. It says data is stored in a document system. We're just kind of sending it downstream, not doing anything with it. Typically uncritical. If you're looking at all of this from the layer of the interface, it is hard to determine if something is actually critical for you or if it's uncritical. And we're going to show you what our approach is to actually understand the flow of data to ultimately determine is there a risk, and then we'll show you how you can actually mitigate that risk. So here's the problem that I always see with how SAP goes into negotiations with their customers. The account executives on SAP's team, they're often not experts on indirect use. Their sole motivation is, here's an area where we might make it a little bit of extra money. Let's look at this. Let's do an audit on site. And they send in their consultants, their audit team. And the way that SAP always approaches these scenarios is to try and set a high watermark. And what I mean by that is they're looking at potential indirect access, and then they're extrapolating it in a way that they just ask you for the massive amount of money that they can come up with. And then typically you would enter some sort of a negotiation, and you would settle and agree on an amount that is okay for you and for SAP. But strategy is always try and ask for the most amount of money that they can. And in this case of the parking gate system, let's look at some facts, right? SAP does an audit. They're looking at some of the data that's going in and out. And let's just assume that they're telling you, hey, we found a daily maximum of 6,200 transactions. So, that's the amount of people that we're seeing entering and using the system. And so the conclusion that we're drawing is you as my customer have to buy an additional 6,201 licenses. Typically, they don't tell you what license type that is. Is it an employee? Is it an ESS? But they usually ask you to buy a professional. So whenever it comes to indirect access, I often see that SAP will initially claim for that particular type of usage, you need to procure professional licenses. So you can imagine this gets very, very expensive. So in the case and in this calculation, I've actually taken, I think, employee licenses here, which in the US cost about $400. I think they're a little bit cheaper in India. But right away, you're starting out at $2.5 million, right? Big amount of money, usually a surprise, it's unbudgeted, and it's hard to push back on that unless you do your own investigation and unless you can present your own data. So here's what we think is a much better approach, and this is typically, the kinds of facts and data that we would produce in a assessment for indirect use, and we want to make sure that you can actually push back to SAP and show them your case and argue in a way that you can reduce your financial risk. So here's our data on the right side. So SAP found 6,200 transactions on a daily maximum. That's true, but when we're taking a closer look, we can actually see that those transactions are really only generated by 3,245 unique users, right? So right out the gate, we're cutting that number in half. And then when we're doing a further analysis, it turns out 1,865 already have a named user account. So that's really behind a lot of these conversations where SAP claims you have to buy a massive amount of licenses. It's usually up to you to see, well, do some of these people have a named user license or not? And so in this case, we can show, yes, a majority actually have licenses. And on top of that, when we're looking at what the business value is and what T codes are actually being submitted, it really only should be an ESS license, if anyway, what we're buying from SAP, right? We're talking about human capital. We're talking about time and attendance. Those are typically ESS type functionalities. So here's our own math. Taking this into account, we're looking at roughly something of an exposure of 172,000, which if you compare that to how SAP would typically approach the audit, that's a vastly reduced amount of money. And if we go to the next slide real quick, we have a checklist that you can use just to initially, ask yourself a few questions. And I'm assuming a lot of you are currently looking into indirect access. You might have been familiar with the concept, but it hasn't really been relevant for you. So this is a good starting point of a few things that you can look at. And I do see a few questions coming in, by the way. Thank you for submitting those. We'll address them very shortly. So we always classify this assessment approach in something you can do in SAP and then two other things you need to do outside of SAP. Excuse me. And A really deep technical approach should start with all of the interfaces you have, even if they're not measured in USMM and law at this point in time. What a lot of people forget, but what's really important for indirect access, is that you might also have connections that have been created by using either a communication or a systems user. So these are the kinds of user types within SAP that are non-dialogue users. So they're typically not cost relevant, but besides RFC connections, oftentimes we see implementations have been created in the past by using these kinds of non-dialogue users. I would also encourage you, if you've worked with a consulting company in the past to implement certain projects, not all of them pay very close attention to the indirect licensing ramifications of their implementation. So it's hard to get a lay of the land initially when you're looking into this. So starting with a survey of all of your third-party systems, all of the RC interfaces, and then in the second step, the activities. So the data that's actually flowing through those interfaces. Typically hard to do by hand. We'll show you a way of doing it in an algorithmic, sort of automated way that we find very powerful to get at the core of this kind of data. What needs to happen outside of SAP, though, is for yourself defining what the business value is for those interfaces. SAP is usually looking at those implementations you have that give you a significant return on investment. Think about what SAP wants in this, right? Oftentimes, customers are looking to buy a competing solution to an SAP product. So if you're thinking about SuccessFactors versus Workday or many other examples, whenever SAP feels like they're losing out on revenue or something, a future purchase from you is threatened, that's usually when they're a little bit more motivated to do an audit, look at those numbers a little bit closer. If you haven't bought any named user licenses in the past 12 to 18 months, we definitely see that the likelihood of an audit is much, much higher, and Gartner actually backs up those claims. So look at the interfaces you have and determine for yourself, is that actually helping us save money? Those are the cases where usually you might have the hardest time arguing with SAP. So if you go to the next slide, Raghu, please. A few of these things we already talked about, right? We know that SAP is looking to protect their intellectual property, and they want to make sure that customers are playing sort of within the rules of what the contract says. But with that also comes a lot of gray area from a legal standpoint around indirect access. Many contracts, especially if they're a little bit older, there is no language whatsoever that governs what indirect access is. And so it makes it really difficult for a customer to understand what can I do, what am I allowed to, and what might be a potential issue. On the other hand, if you have recently signed the new order form, pay attention to that very closely, because with the latest design of the order form, you might actually be agreeing to the most current price list of SAP, and that can override any of the contractual agreements you might have made with SAP in the past that might have served you well. So definitely always look at the current terms that come with the order form. It's definitely one of those tricky things in the way that SAP puts appendix after appendix on your agreement, that if you're not careful, and these appendices are difficult to interpret, but if you're not careful, you might be agreeing to new terms that might put you at a disadvantage. Of course, on the side of the customer, we want to make sure that the licensing is actually transparent, that it gives us a certain amount of flexibility in running our business, and you can already see that there's quite a bit of tension here, and at least from a legal perspective, we'll talk about this a little bit toward the end, but there is a legal foundation for SAP to take its customers to court. So taking this whole approach of we're just going to wait and see if they do an audit, we'll take this into a court. That's been proven to really not work that well. So what we would suggest to you today is be proactive. Continue this this mission you already started of investigating what this is, understand your risk, and be prepared to have that conversation. We did a similar webinar about a month ago with around 350 attendees, and 80% of them said that they felt that the topic was going to be relevant in the very near future and that they're going to have to talk to SAP about this. And there really is no difference that I see between United Kingdom, United States, Southern America, India, Australia. They're all different markets, but SAP is the same company, and I definitely see a lot of similarity in that. So Raghu, if you could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to show you what we have come up with in terms of being able to analyze indirect use from a very technical standpoint. And this is something we've been actually doing for about 2 years now. But you can imagine since the Diageo ruling, everyone's really interested in investigating this. So it's been a pleasure for us to help people and actually show them what they can do to be prepared. So I mentioned earlier that there's not just dialogue users on SAP, there's actually also communication, service users, system users, and all of those can be used to potentially connect third-party solutions or your homegrown applications, right? So we have a background in license optimization, cost avoidance, and this is also where Raghu at ToggleNow has been such a wonderful partner to us. That's also what his background is, and so he'll be able to actually advise you on licensing strategies. But the solution that we've built and what we've been using for about 10 years now is a solution that dynamically reassigns licenses on SAP, and the bottom line always is let's try to be efficient in the way that we're purchasing licenses, and also let's make sure that we're not buying something we don't need. So what we typically do to analyze indirect access, we would move away from scanning the dialogue users to doing a discovery of interfaces and then non-dialogue user types. So you can see a sample output on the right. We're finding some of these potential interfaces just by moving away from dialogue users and actually running that discovery across all of your systems. Next slide, please. Now, where it gets really interesting is looking at activity. So we're looking at data throughput, and the reason we want to do this is, as I said earlier, SAP might often ask you, you need to buy professional users, which can very likely be overkill, so way too much for the use case that you actually have. So by looking at the data throughput, we can actually determine this interface, the majority of activity going through the connection. Is that people creating data? Is it people changing data? Or are people maybe just looking at data, running reports, running display transactions? And once you understand that, you really have a much better foundation to push back and say, well, the way that we're using this interface, it doesn't make sense for us to buy professional licenses. It's actually only running reports, and having access to those facts will allow you to actually come up with your own licensing strategy and tell SAP exactly what it is that you need, rather than having them drive the discussions and putting you on the defense if you're surprised by it. So one of the things that we typically do across all of the interfaces that have been detected is looking at the ones that are really critical for indirect use, right? So in this example here, we actually see 8 interfaces that are actively creating data. And so that's usually where we want to spend our time taking a closer look at what those are and what's happening there. The lower box where it says administration activities, those are typically uncritical, right? That's perfectly fine, allowed in the terms of use of SAP. Again, though, if you have a lot of interfaces, let's say 100, or some customers have up to 1,000, it's almost impossible to look at those interfaces and say right away, well, these 50 actually save, these 10 might be critical, and these 2 are definitely critical, right? So lots of work to do by hand, much, much easier if you have somewhat of a technical automated approach. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that understanding indirect access always needs to happen in the context of your business, right? So let's say we're looking at a particular interface and we're seeing, hey, hold on, there's maintenance orders coming in through this particular interface, right? So it's an indication that production data is being generated, but we need to understand what really is the context of this. Is that legitimate, or does it potentially put you at risk for indirect access? So if we have the next slide, Raghu, I'm not sure if we have access to it. I think we might have stripped it out, so I'll just talk about it, and we can stay on this slide. So I'll give you two examples of what might be happening, right? If this, for instance, is coming in out, you know, in the sort of context of a maintenance plan, that would be perfectly acceptable, right? That's you as a customer are entitled to generate maintenance orders if that's part of the way that you have licensed it with SAP. On the other hand, though, if those are maintenance orders that are generated from outside your company to maybe start a repair process, or it's maintenance orders for products that you sell, and a customer of yours is starting this process via a web shop, that's really where it gets tricky. And so one point is, you know, finding evidence of what could be classified as indirect use. And then the second step is always, you know, spend time speaking with the stakeholders at your company. If we're doing a consulting engagement, we would typically speak with your team, understand, you know, what is this really, kind of show you areas where, you know, we want to spend some time understanding this. And then there's always this consulting piece, or this qualitative understanding of indirect access that will ultimately tell you, is this critical or is it non-critical? But having an indication of the places where it might be happening is a huge advantage in initially determining if there is any risk for you. Next slide, please. Let me quickly take a look at some of the questions that have come in here. Seeing. Yeah, I'll take the questions at the end, and we're almost done. This is actually the last slide, so if you bear with us, we're transitioning over into the Q&A very shortly. A few things that we want to share with you today that we've seen as best practices that usually give you a bit more leverage if you are in the unlucky situation of either going through an unfriendly audit or, you know, discussing this with SAP. Here's something that we've seen that worked very well with clients in the past. So remember that the account executives on SAP sides definitely are not experts on indirect use, right? So when we're working with clients, our goal is to prepare them better and arm them with facts so that they're actually better informed than the SAP account executives. That gives you a lot of leverage. And oftentimes, you know, if the account executive kind of brings up the topic and says, well, you know, what do you think about indirect use? And you can just say, boom, you know, these are the three reasons why this is not relevant for us. You can oftentimes, you know, scare them off, and they might not bring it up for another couple of months. Second tip that I have, definitely don't fill out the discovery sheet. There's been some form that I've seen being sent around to customers where it says, you know, hey, why don't you give us a, you know, a list of the third-party applications that you guys use, and we'll get back to you and let you know if this is critical or not. Definitely don't do that. If you get the sheet, you know, ask for more time, try to stall and be vague, and really do your own investigation. The last thing that you want to do is to disclose too much information and potentially put you at risk for something that might not be critical, right? We said earlier, SAP will always go for the highest sort of claim that they can come up with because their goal is to settle anyway. If they're asking you for 20 million, they might be happy settling on 7, but you're going to have to go through that negotiation, and the more power that you have, the better for you. Next point, try to speak one-on-one. Do it on the phone, do it in person. Don't leave any paper trails. So don't send emails. Typically works better for you if you know, you try to get a little bit of information from them, but don't disclose too much about what your situation is. Also, if SAP thinks that they found an infraction for indirect use, let them explain why they think that is. Like, let them clearly classify why that violates your contract, and, you know, ask more questions rather than providing what your use case is. And so, you know, the point being here, don't give the impression that you're being caught. Don't give in too early. Even in cases where customers have, have been surprised by an audit, it is very possible to push back up to about 50% of that initial claim just by negotiating. So don't just accept what they're saying. And that also goes, by the way, for the annual self-audit. If you have a true-up, don't pay it right away. Like, do your own analysis and make sure that the data they're showing you is actually accurate. So once you do a bit of an assessment and an analysis, either with a consulting company like us, or if you're doing it by yourself, use those hard facts. That really is the most powerful thing you can do when talking about anything with the big publishers like SAP or Oracle. They're essentially the same when it comes to these things. And don't accept the standard terms that SAP might give you. Last thing that I want to mention, if you are currently in that unfriendly audit situation, just like I said, it is possible to push back quite a bit if you start negotiating. So never accept the first claim that they make. There's always room to actually have discussions. And with that, before we go into the Q&A, I'll hand it back over to Raghu, who can sort of cue us out, and then we'll take your questions. So I do see a few questions in the chat. I would encourage you, if you have any others, please ask them now. We'll get to them one by one right now. But Raghu, why don't you cue us out?
Right. Thanks, Sebastian, for your time. And yeah, so if you guys have any specific questions, then we'll be able to answer them. Or Sebastian, why can't you pick up the questions from the chat and then?
Yeah, I'm looking. So why don't we start with this question? So the question is, if you have partners accessing your SAP, if you create named user IDs for those partners, will that cover indirect use? Or do you need SAP licenses for each employee working for your partner? So that's a good question. If you already have a named user license in place, you're probably okay. And there's two different ways in which that could have happened in the past. I know that some clients have some sort of an agreement with SAP where it says they have a specific business partner license for a portal, and if you have that in place, at least for that one particular interface, that's good. That without knowing the entire context, I would say if you have a named user license for the individual party accessing SAP, that is good. What gets tricky is if, let's say, you have one named user license, but this is really being used by 10 people behind it, right? So SAP always asks its customers, you have to have that one-to-one relationship, meaning that, my partner, Raghu, if he wants to access SAP, the named user has to be in Raghu's name. If his colleagues also start using SAP, that's when it gets tricky. And in the case of many interfaces, the connections might have been made through one single data point. So you have one connection that's going to an interface, and then you might have 100 people piping their data through that one data point. And that's where it gets really tricky. If you already have a named user license for the individual business partners, you should be okay. But look at the other areas in your landscape, right? That might not be the only interface you have. I'm sure there's others. And just because you've licensed one part of this indirect access story doesn't mean that SAP might look in a different area and find something else. I hope that answers your question. What's your thought on dealing with an SAP platform license? It looks like that's the other way that SAP is charging for using third-party SAP add-ons, as a professional license is not covering these types of licenses. Gautam, are you thinking specifically about the NetWeaver third-party license, or it'd be great if you could clarify in the chat real quick what kinds of platform licenses you're thinking of, because there's a ton of different SAP products. So if you could specify, I'll get back to that question. For the interim, the one other question that we got is, do you recommend creating all indirect users within your SAP landscape? How do you want to classify your SAP indirect users, say like professional or limited professional? I think this is a really good question, and you definitely want to create those users within the SAP landscape. That's really the only place where the accounts can be provisioned, And your question is getting at one of the major points of indirect access, which is how do you actually classify those users? And you can only really do that if you're looking at what those people are doing, right? So on the level of T codes, if you can say we have 100 people or 1,000 people and they're changing data or they're creating data or they're running certain financial reports, if you're doing that analysis on the level of individual T codes, it'll be much easier for you to actually classify them in this whole regard of indirect use. So the ones of you who have a bit of a background in direct licensing, you can actually see that there's quite a bit of overlap between creating cost efficiency on the direct licensing front that also carries over to indirect. So with SAP, you never want to go and look at roles of people because that really leads to severe over-licensing. If all you're doing is looking at the roles that a certain group has, and if someone has a lot of authorizations and access, you're going to end up using a license that's too expensive for them. Once you understand what people are really doing, so looking at usage, right, you'll be able to assign much cheaper licenses to those use cases. And over the entire size of an SAP landscape, it can literally be millions of dollars depending on how big your SAP systems are. We just got one more question. What about the data flow from third-party systems through PI, inbound and outbound? Is that classified as indirect access? Wonderful question, Suman. Thank you for asking that. Absolutely. PI is another area that you need to investigate. Suman, I don't know if you joined pretty late toward the webinar, or if you've been on for the entire time, but one thing we said earlier is that it's not just RFC connections. It's actually also PI, it's iDocs, it's XML. You need to understand how those connections are actually leveraged to create business value for you. I've seen cases where iDocs has been at the core of an indirect access claim, and PI absolutely. We typically investigate that during assessments, and it needs to be taken into account when you're trying to find out if there's any risk for you. Hope that helps. It looks like Gautam added some clarification. So NetWeaver add-on licenses. Oh, now the chat is moving quite a bit. Yeah, Gautam, it's a tricky question, and I would encourage you to maybe have an offline discussion with either Raghu or me. Happy to chat with you. It is an interesting case, and I have seen that happening as well. And one thing I can share with you is that this whole NetWeaver third-party thing, I'll take a step back. We're headquartered in Germany. I'm based out of New York City, but our company headquarters are in Munich. And so it's the same country as SAP, and oftentimes these auditing trends start in Germany and then they roll them out to new markets. And currently SAP is looking to actually monetize this whole NetWeaver third-party platform, situation. And the user group in Germany has sued SAP, and it's been taken to court. But they just found a temporary agreement, and they're actually going to look at customers whose contract dates back before, after 2010. You might be, looking at having to buy additional NetWeaver third-party licenses. So again, I don't want to, drift too far away, but this is definitely something. If you're interested about it, shoot us a quick note, and we can talk about this offline. Shahid is also asking a question. We have our SAP ERP system connected to third-party system, Quantum. All the users who will be accessing Quantum are active professional users. So we do not have any concern here. But the problem, Quantum will be connected to BankSwift in the future, and the SAP data will flow from SAP ERP to Quantum to BankSwift. Do I see any concern from SAP? Good question. Where I would typically start is looking at, what's happening with that data after. I'm assuming you're doing some sort of, accounts payable here. The question I would ask you is, are you involving an additional user group when you are connecting Quantum to BankSwift? Is that still It's a treasury system. Yeah, I'm not 100% familiar with that solution, but I agree with you that the professional users that are accessing Quantum, you should typically be fine. With that additional connection, I can't say for sure right now. I think I would need a little bit of extra context. I don't know if there's an additional user group that might be involved once you add that additional downstream system. But again, happy to discuss with you if you want to ping Raghu or ping myself. We can definitely talk about that. It looks like we're getting close to a hard stop here. If you have additional questions, I'm happy to answer them. So please feel free to ask them. We do have a couple more minutes, so yeah, great, Suman, sure. And then Raghu, let's make a note to ourselves so that we can actually follow up with Shahid and Gautam on those two questions. I think it might be easier to either talk in person or have a bit of an email exchange.
Sure. I'm making
those
note of these questions.
Yeah, perfect. And I'm assuming Suman is still typing his question, so we'll give him another minute. Raghu, what have you seen in the past so far in India? I know you've assisted many companies around indirect use. What's your take on this? Like, what do you typically see is the risk for companies from a monetary perspective? I know you shared that one story with me recently. I think where a client only had 50 SAP licenses, and then SAP came up with this ridiculous claim. What's your take on all of this? Do you have any anecdotes you can share while Suman's typing his question?
Yes. So thanks for getting that. So it's another business case that we had in with one of the Indian client, wherein the client has got only 50 user licenses. Wherein he has connected an in-house grown system. So all the users will be accessing that particular software, wherein the data read happens in the SAP database. So instead of connecting it to SAP directly, they have used the database which SAP uses, pulled up some data from that SAP database, and also used to update the data, into SAP and directly into the database as well. So they have multiple interfaces which actually talks to the database as well as the SAP application directly. So this particular case has been identified as an indirect usage by SAP, and SAP has asked them to buy about 300,000 user licenses for all the users who are using the third party application. So this happened about six to 8 months ago, wherein we stepped in, we negotiated with SAP, we gave certain inputs on what kind of data it is, what kind of users are required, and then we were able to help the customer with resolving this particular issue, and then ended up getting them onto the HANA platform, and then getting few user licenses for them, and then that is what exactly we did with this customer.
Yeah, thanks, Raghu. And I think for me, it just sort of highlights again that the claims can sometimes be outrageous, even for someone who only has 50 SAP user licenses. Suman, it looks like you typed out your question. Thank you. And the question is data interchange using mount points or FTP as a batch data upload, is that considered indirect access? And obviously, if not, Suman would like to use that as a workaround. But what I can tell you is that batch jobs are typically not considered indirect access. You have to ask yourself the question with this, batch data upload, what are you trying to achieve? If you're trying to outsmart SAP to work around a scenario that typically would be indirect access, in that case, I'd be careful. So what I mean by that is, one of the sort of rules of thumb that SAP has given to one of our customers is, if you want to determine if there is risk for indirect use, here's the rule that SAP gave to our customer. So you should ask yourself the question, is there real-time or at least near-time processing of data within your third-party system. So I would argue that in the case of this batch data upload, if you're just adding that as somewhat of a middle step to then take that data and process it outside of SAP, that sounds risky. If there is a significant amount of time between those two steps, where maybe you're pulling a backup or you're storing data somewhere else, I wouldn't say that that's critical. That sounds like fair use. But what I'm sort of reading between the lines in your question is that it sounds like you might be looking at a potential batch data upload to add somewhat of an additional step to muddle the waters a little bit more. If that's how you're thinking to use it, I would tell you be a little careful. That might not save you 100%. So to summarize, batch jobs typically uncritical. When you're sending data out of SAP through whatever means, whether it's iDocs, XML, or a data upload, if that's being processed somewhere else and you're getting value from that, take a closer look, because that might be something that SAP would like to monetize. I hope that helps, Suman.
So I'd like to add something here. So we recently worked with one of the customer where they were using a third-party software wherein their day-to-day transaction happens, wherein they have about close to 2,500 sales staff. So end of the day, they actually get all the data downloaded from the third-party solution and upload it back to the SAP system, right? Process it in the SAP, and then next day they download some data again back to FTP from the SAP and upload it back to the third-party software. So that is how they are transacting to reduce the amount of users, named users on the SAP side. Right. So this particular case is definitely identified as an indirect usage because there is huge amount of data which is getting downloaded and uploaded back into a SAP. So this is where we need to be very careful. A regular batch data upload might not uh, be classified as a critical. It's a less critical, but then if the amount of data that you are uploading and downloading using FTPs or any other means, then SAP might look at it and then classify it as an indirect usage. Sebastian, if you want to add something to it, please.
No, I think that's a nice point that you make there, and the bottom line is always, are we externalizing certain processes that could technically happen within SAP? Are we taking them outside of the system and then using SAP data in a way that would typically require a license if it were happening within SAP? I think that's really at the core of all of this.
Yes.
And so oftentimes it manifests itself as a number of employees that are using a Salesforce CRM. They don't have access to SAP directly, but through that interface connection, they are gaining access, right? So you can really think of it. I think what you just said sums up the session today pretty nicely. And maybe a few last points that I want to make is it really is a huge gray area. There's not a lot of language in the contract. So every SAP contract I've seen is different. Every client has their own language. So speak with your legal team, pull in other stakeholders, make sure you have that dialogue inside of your company to get ahead of SAP and to be proactive. And then speak to experts in the area if you have in-depth questions. If there's something that you can sort of determine by yourself, do a technical analysis. Really understand for yourself if there's any risk, because the last thing that that you want to do is be surprised and sort of caught red-handed. Always good to investigate this early, and like we said, Gartner backs up the same claim. It is going to become relevant at some point, and you'll find yourself in that situation talking about this with SAP sooner or later. So with that, thank you for attending. I know it's getting pretty late in India, so we'll share our contact information. I believe that Raghu has your email addresses when you signed up as well. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Let us know if you have additional questions. Thank you for your attendance and for the great questions today.
Thanks. So we shared our contact details here in this slide. So we'll be reaching out to you, and then as rightly pointed by Sebastian, in case if you have any questions, you can direct your questions to us, and then we are happy to answer them. And thanks everyone. Have a great evening, and hope to see you guys soon. Thanks.
Bye-bye.